the most perverted kings in medieval history, and more. Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into the extravagant, scandalous, and sometimes downright questionable bedrooms of medieval royalty, a world where power, passion, and a shocking lack of personal boundaries clashed in ways you can hardly imagine. Before we get too comfortable, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy exploring the strange corners of history with me. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how far this little community reaches across the globe. Now, dim your lights, maybe switch on a fan for that cozy background hum, and settle in, because tonight's journey through royal bedrooms is about to get chaotic. Let's begin with King John of England, also known as John Lackland, and, unofficially, the worst dinner guest in British history. You probably remember him for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow still finding time to behave like an absolute menace to the women of the royal court. John's reign, from 1199 to 1216, was practically a manual on how not to rule. Politically disastrous, and personally, somehow even worse. John didn't just have lovers, he took them. He was infamous for abducting noble women, locking them away in royal castles, and entertaining them until they were either married off to someone else or simply forgotten. John's favorite method for weakening powerful families wasn't war, it was seduction. He'd charm the wives, humiliate the husbands, and then double their taxes for good measure. Ruthless and efficient, chroniclers of the time were so appalled that even the most biased medieval scribes, the kind who didn't blink at witch trials or public floggings, wrote lines like, "He was not temperate with women and did not abstain from wives and daughters." That's medieval code for this guy made every Christmas feast painfully uncomfortable. At one point, John reportedly had 30 mistresses on official record. That's not romance, that's human resource mismanagement. His behavior became so intolerable that nobles started filing complaints accusing him of abusing their hospitality, which is a polite way of saying he was sleeping with everyone, possibly including the help, and maybe even the livestock. His reputation got so bad it almost triggered a rebellion, not over politics or taxes, but because half the barons were terrified to leave their wives alone when John came visiting. One noble even refused to meet the king unless his entire household was locked up first. That's diplomacy, medieval style. And yet, in true royal delusion, John saw no problem. He believed himself irresistible, though there's absolutely no evidence to support that outside his own letters. But when you wear a crown, a little delusion apparently comes free with the job. By the end of his reign, John had managed to leave behind a country in chaos, a noble class that despised him, and probably a few illegitimate children no one dared to mention at court. He was the kind of monarch who made people invent democracy just to keep him out of their houses. Not the most evil king in history, perhaps, but definitely the last person you'd trust to babysit. But as we move forward in time, the madness doesn't stop. In fact, it gets worse. Our next royal makes King John look almost reasonable. Meet Charles VI of France, better known as Charles the Mad. His story? A tragic spiral from brilliance to insanity, and one that changed the fate of France forever. Stay tuned. Things are about to get even darker. And now, things take a darker, stranger turn. What began as royal eccentricity slowly spiraled into complete madness. Our next ruler forgot who he was, attacked his own knights, and, in perhaps one of the strangest royal delusions in history, became convinced that he was made of glass. Borgias, you heard that right, the king of Fra? NCA truly believed he might shatter if anyone touched him. He ordered his servants to wrap him in blankets before walking so he wouldn't crack. It wasn't exactly a symbol of royal strength, but it was, without a doubt, a masterclass in creative paranoia. Most monarchs who think they're fragile glass, figures, tend to stay out of the spotlight. But not Charles VI of France, famously known as Charles the Mad. He somehow managed to balance a royal mistress, a crumbling kingdom, and a civil war, all while fearing that his own body might shatter. His long-suffering queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, did her best to keep the court running, while Charles spent his days fleeing from mirrors and refusing to bathe because he feared water would melt him. Meanwhile, his mistress, Odette de Champdivers, quietly moved into the palace, politely introduced as the king's comfort, which in medieval language meant, don't ask questions, just nod. Odette stayed by his side through the worst of his breakdown. WNS. Whether she possessed the patience of a saint or the property rights of a queen, no one can say. She brushed his hair, listened to his glass-inspired monologues, and helped him put on padded layers of clothing so he could sit safely without breaking. Nothing says royal romance quite like strapping your monarch into a medieval pillow suit. But Charles's eccentricities weren't confined to the bedroom. He loved elaborate court entertainment, until one of them nearly ended in tragedy. During a notorious celebration known as the Ball of the Burning Men, Charles and his companions dressed as wild men in flammable costumes and danced around with torches. Predictably, someone dropped a flame. The hall erupted into chaos as several courtiers burned alive. Charles survived, but his dignity and what little sanity he had left did not. Despite all this, he somehow fathered 12 children, several conceived during rare moments of clarity, or at least partial clarity. Records don't whether he remembered their names, but one assumes he avoided naming any of them Glass. In the end, Charles VI ruled France into chaos, but he did so with a flair unmatched by any monarch before or after him, turning mental illness, royal scandal, and accidental pyrotechnics into one unforgettable royal tragedy. Next up, we meet Peter the Cruel, also known, by those who managed to survive him, as Pedro the Just. He ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369, and his version of romance was a bizarre mix of charm, jealousy, and bloodshed. Peter's love life could make a telenovela look tame. He fell deeply for Maria de Padilla, a noblewoman he may have secretly married. The problem? He was also being married off to other women for political alliances, which made things, well, complicated. One of these unfortunate brides was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman Peter married and locked away in a castle. Just 3 days after the wedding, she spent the rest of her life imprisoned because Peter decided he preferred Maria's hair, or maybe he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Either way, it was ghosting taken to a royal level. Maria, however, became his lifelong obsession. Even after marrying other women, Peter remained devoted to her. When she died, he wept for days, then posthumously declared her his lawful wife, mostly to confuse everyone and justify their 4 children. But Peter's passion wasn't poetic, it was dangerous. When another mistress, Doña Juana, tried to leave him, she was later found in pieces, as were several of his political rivals. Peter was known to watch executions from his balcony while lounging with a mistress. Romantic? Not quite. Think HBO villain with trust issues. For Peter, his court was a storm of gossip, revenge, and unpredictable outbursts. For Peter, love and violence were 2 sides of the same coin, and he flipped it constantly. In the end, his own half-brother killed him, ending his reign in what can only be described as medieval family therapy. The Cruel remains remembered as Europe's most unromantic romantic, a man who brought siege weapons to the battlefield of love. Moving to England, meet Edward II, who ruled from 1307 to 1327. History remembers him for 2 things: losing the Battle of Bannockburn to the Scots, and showing far more affection to his male favorites than to his queen. One of those was treason, the other, just bad dinner etiquette. His closest companion was Piers Gaveston, childhood friend, rumored lover, and full-time fashion icon. Piers wasn't just close to Edward, he was showered with titles, estates, and jewels that didn't even match his outfits. At Edward's coronation, Piers sparkled brighter than the crown itself. Not a great idea when your survival depends on nobles not hating you. Spoiler, they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, came with political power and expectations. none of which included sharing the throne with her husband's best friend/possible boyfriend. When the nobles demanded Gaveston's exile, Edward reluctantly agreed, only to bring him back like a lovesick teenager with castles instead of text messages. Eventually, Emia, a man who technically wore a crown but ruled like a chaotic college student on an endless weekend. He held impressive titles, King of the Romans, King of Bohemia, but his real achievements included public nudity, aggressive drinking, and starting bar fights inside his own palace. If you're thinking of good King Wenceslas from the Christmas Carol, think again. That was his ancestor. This Wenceslas was not good, not noble, and definitely not sober. Our story now takes us from madness to intoxication, and not the poetic kind. Meet a king who ruled not from a throne, but from the bottom of a wine cup, a man who thought politics and drinking games belonged in the same sentence. Yes, this is the tale of Wenceslaus of Bohemia, a ruler who began his reign with potential, young, clever, multilingual, and seemingly destined for greatness. But somewhere along the way, he decided that the royal wine cellar was a more valuable advisor than the entire treasury. Wenceslaus quickly earned a reputation for hosting drinking sessions that lasted for days, sometimes even weeks. Royal policy was discussed between rounds of mead, questionable limericks, and the occasional bar fight disguised as a debate. His council meetings were legendary disasters. Advisors came prepared not with scrolls or ink, but with flasks, not to celebrate, but to survive. Arguments often ended with someone flipping a table or challenging another noble to a duel using breadsticks. Then there was his new habit, streaking through the royal halls. One historian even noted that the king once delivered official decrees completely naked, save for his sword belt. His reasoning? Clothes are for cowards. Hard to argue when the guy making the rules also has a sword and no pants. When it came to love, Wenceslaus didn't discriminate. Barmaids, laundresses, even the wives of nobles. Everyone was fair game, but it wasn't affection he was after. It was usually just a good drink recommendation. Romantic. Affairs weren't scandals in his court, they were basically job interviews. One noble once accused him of seducing his sister. Wenceslaus simply shrugged and offered him a drink. Eventually, even the Holy Roman Empire had enough. They politely stripped him of his title as King of the Romans. The medieval version of saying, "You're fired, but let's call it a political reshuffle." Even his own brother called him useless, unclothed, and usually unconscious. Still, Wenceslaus managed to cling to the Bohemian throne for decades. His subjects tolerated him like a loud uncle at a wedding, with forced smiles, strategic distance, and a lot of alcohol. When he finally left this world, he also left behind a kingdom on shaky legs, a flooded wine cellar, and a royal legacy best described as, he ruled every day like it was the morning after. Next we journey to England, home of a king who proved what happens when absolute power meets absolute hormones. Henry VIII ruled from 1509 to 1547 SP, ending most of his reign either getting married, divorced, or furious at the Pope for not supporting his ever-changing love life. You've probably heard the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that's only the trailer for what was essentially the world's first royal soap opera. Let's start with Catherine, Aragon, wife number 1. After 20 years of marriage, Henry decided God was punishing him for not producing a male heir. Naturally, instead of introspection, he chose mass chaos. He sought an annulment, got excommunicated, and created an entirely new branch of Christianity, the Church of England, all because he wanted to date someone else. That's not religious reform, that's petty on a national scale. Enter Anne Boleyn, wife number 2, the woman who flipped Henry's world upside down. He wrote her letters full of passion, poetry, and questionable rhyme schemes. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greats. Rulers, but no son. Anne's downfall came fast. Accused of adultery, witchcraft, and the unforgivable crime of giving attitude, she was beheaded after only 3 years of marriage. Henry moved on faster than a man switching channels. Next came Jane Seymour, who finally gave Henry the son he so desperately wanted, Edward VI, before tragically dying from childbirth complications. Henry mourned deeply for about 11 days before looking for wife number 4. Ebru and her Anne of Cleves. Henry chose her from a portrait. Big mistake. Upon meeting her in person, he famously complained that she looked like a Flanders mare. The marriage lasted 6 months and ended amicably, basically a 16th century no-fault divorce. Febref. Then came Catherine Howard, a much younger bride who was, let's say, less subtle in her affairs. She was executed for adultery, though, to be fair. Being married to Henry by that point meant enduring paranoia, gout, and a man who still believed he was a ladies' man, despite needing assistance to walk. Finally, there was Catherine Parr, wife number 6, intelligent, calm, and smart enough to stay alive. She survived Henry by being patient, diplomatic, and absolutely excellent at dodging treason charges. By the time Henry died, he had bankrupted England, eaten half its livestock, and turned the royal palace into something between a courtroom and a daytime drama. His reign was a storm of power, lust, and betrayal, and somehow, it's still being turned into musicals today. Henry VIII didn't just love, he conquered, destroyed, and left behind a legacy so infamous, it makes modern celebrity scandals look tame. And just when you think European monarchs couldn't get any wilder, along comes Francis I of France, ruling from 1515 to 1547, the literal embodiment of the Renaissance, educated, charming, cultured, and hopelessly addicted to pleasure. Francis was a patron of art, poetry, and anything that wore silk. He brought Leonardo da Vinci to France and filled his palaces with masterpieces. Yet somehow, he still couldn't keep his trousers buttoned. But that, dear viewers, is a tale for our next chapter, where the line between art, love, and scandal becomes delightfully blurred. To give him credit where it's due, Francis I of France wasn't just any ruler, he was the ultimate Renaissance king, charming, artistic, and dangerously irresistible. A man who turned France into a cultural superpower, and his royal court into something resembling a very luxurious dating app. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, built breathtaking palaces, and filled them with art, poetry, and scandal. While painters painted and poets poet-ed, Francis was busy chasing anything that breathed, preferably with a noble title attached. His court was legendary, glittering with gold, velvet, and a faint hint of perfume. But behind the glamour, it functioned like a state-sponsored romantic experiment. His so-called gentlewomen of the bedchamber were suppos to be ladies-in-waiting. In practice, they were more like a royal shortlist of potential flings. Politics didn't stand a chance. Entire alliances collapsed because Francis couldn't resist the ambassador's wife, and he wasn't discreet about it either. Once, at a formal gathering, he proudly declared that French kings must be exceptional lovers. Sounds noble until you remember it came from a man who treated treaties and mistresses with the same enthusiasm and the same lack of commitment. His most famous relationship was with Françoise de Foix, a clever, sharp-tongued noblewoman who became his official mistress. She was brilliant, outspoken, and possibly the only woman who could roast the king in public and live to tell the tale. But of course she too was eventually replaced by Anne de Pisseleu-de-Hailly, a woman whose name sounded like an inside joke but whose influence over Francis was no laughing matter. She knew how to play the game, and win it. Even his enemies noticed. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once remarked that Francis was more dangerous in bed than on the battlefield. He meant it as an insult. Francis probably took it as the highest compliment. Yet, despite the affairs, the banquets, and the endless drama, Francis ruled effectively. His wars were costly, his romances even costlier, but his energy was unmatched. His reign was a blur of silk sheets, candlelit scandals, and diplomatic flirtations. Francis I wasn't just a king, he was France's most charming liability, and truth be told, he wouldn't have wanted to be remembered any other way. Now, let's move from France to Castile, where passion wasn't just a pastime, it was a full-blown royal crisis. Meet Alfonso She of Castile, who ruled from 1311 to 1350. He had one major interest outside governing, publicly ignoring his wife in favor of another woman, in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. His wife, Maria of Portugal, was noble, diplomatic, and politically useful. Unfortunately, she wasn't Leonor de Guzman, the woman Alfonso actually adored. Leonor was a Castilian noblewoman with wit, power, and enough ambition to run the kingdom herself. She bore him 11 children and practically turned the royal court into her personal headquarters. While Queen Maria was left sitting alone at banquets, Alfonso paraded Leonor through the halls like a royal trophy. She didn't even bother pretending to hide it. Why would she? She already had the king wrapped around her finger. And Leonor wasn't just a mistress, she was a political powerhouse. She negotiated treaties, commanded respect, and produced heirs like it was state policy. Alfonso, meanwhile, didn't even pretend to care about appearances. He built Leonor palaces, gifted her lands, and spent all his time with her, leaving his wife humiliated and isolated. Naturally, this didn't go over well with Maria's father, who, awkwardly enough, was the king of Portugal. At one point, tensions got so bad that the situation nearly triggered an all-out war. Imagine your in-laws being so angry about your affair that they consider military action. Still, Alfonso didn't care. He continued living happily ever after with Leonor, until the Black Death swept through in 1350 and ended the affair permanently. After Alfonso's death, Queen Maria finally got her revenge. She had Leonor imprisoned and executed, an ending historians call politically motivated, and everyone else calls absolutely justified. Alfonso may have been remembered for his victories in battle, but history never forgot that he was also one of the most publicly lovesick rulers ever to sit on a throne. And now we travel to medieval France once again, to meet a man known as Philip IV, or as history remembers him, Philip the Fair. But don't be fooled. Fair referred to his looks, not his personality. He ruled from 1285 to 1314 with a face fit for a coin and a heart fit for a courtroom drama. Outwardly, Philip was solemn, devout, and morally upright. Inwardly, he ran his kingdom like a medieval reality show, filled with betrayal, hidden scandals, and enough double standards to make your head spin. His most infamous episode? The Tour de Nesle affair, a royal scandal so juicy it could have been written by HBO. It all started with his daughter Isabella. Yes, that Isabella, the one who later helped overthrow England's Edward II. She began to suspect that her sisters-in-law were getting a little too friendly with certain knights, and not in the courtly chivalry sense. When Isabella reported her suspicions, Philip launched an investigation with all the subtlety of a battering ram. Soon, 2 of the royal princesses, both married to his sons, were accused of adultery. The knights were executed brutally, while the princesses were imprisoned for years, their heads shaved, their titles stripped, and their dignity destroyed. It was a national scandal, one that exposed just how hypocritical Philip's moral crusades really were. The man who claimed to defend virtue had turned his own family into the centerpiece of France's most notorious scandal. The scandal didn't end with accusations. It turned into a royal horror show. The 2 knights accused of adultery were tortured, flayed, and publicly executed because nothing screams moral leadership like turning a family drama into a medieval snuff film. But here's where things get truly ironic. While Philip IV, the Fair, was publicly punishing others for immorality, whispers around court suggested that he had a few secrets of his own. Rumors claimed he kept several mistresses hidden in private chambers of the Louvre itself. Some even said he maintained a quiet circle of young women, conveniently available to entertain visiting diplomats, all, of course, in the name of diplomacy. Yet nobody ever dared question the king's private sins. After all, when you're the one writing the rules, hypocrisy becomes a royal privilege. Philip also had a kenne. CK for using religion as a tool when it suited him. Take his infamous destruction of the Knights Templar. He accused them of heresy, but everyone knew the truth. It was about their gold. He basically robbed his own bankers, called it divine justice, and got away with it. So yes, Philip may have looked pious, disciplined, and devout, but behind that sculpted face was a man fluent in corruption and very aware of every secret passage in the castle. A fair king, perhaps, but only in name. Next up is a man who treated thrones like collectibles. Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor, collected crowns the way most people collect wine goblets, which, incidentally, he also collected with enthusiasm. Reigning from the late 14th to the mid-15th century, Sigismund was intelligent, cultured, and fluent in several languages. He was also spectacularly scandalous, the kind of man who could run a crusade by day and a romantic comedy by all this chaos. Sigismund was remarkably successful. He launched crusades, hosted the Council of Constance, reformed imperial law, and still found time to manage a love life so turbulent that Casanova would have taken notes. One ambassador once said, "Sigismund greets all women as equals, especially in private." Le progressive? Maybe. Problematic? Absolutely. Iberche. But somehow, through all the scandal and seduction, Sigismund remained wildly popular. He was a king, a diplomat, and a walking romantic disaster. A true one-man renaissance who broke every rule and somehow got away with it. Fast forward to 18th century France and meet Louis XV, famously known as Louis the Beloved. He ruled from 1715 to 1774, though, to be fair, ruled might be too strong a word. What he really did was host an ongoing royal after-party where politics were optional and pleasure was mandatory. Louis began with promise. Handsome, well-educated, and expected to follow in the footsteps of his great-grandfather, Son King, Louis XIV. But by his 20s, he seemed to decide that running a kingdom was less fun than running a harem. Let's talk about Parc aux Cerfs, the quiet little mansion near Versailles that Louis used for, let's call them private auditions. Poor but pretty young women were discreetly brought in, entertained the king, and then quietly rotated out. There were so many that the palace guards might as well have used a sign-up sheet. Among his many mistresses, the most famous was Madame de Pompadour. Not just beautiful, but brilliant. She was witty, politically sharp, and effectively ran France from behind the scenes. When their romantic relationship cooled, Louis simply said, "That's fine," and built a second harem for, shall we say, non-political purposes. His logic was simple. Pompadour for strategy and conversation, the Parc aux Cerfs for everything else. It was chaos. But somehow, organized chaos. Each mistress got gifts, titles, and often a cozy retirement plan once. Her contract ended. Meanwhile, Queen Marie Leczinska faded into the background, too polite to protest and too royal to divorce. Once she stopped bearing children, Louis treated her like antique furniture, too valuable to remove, too dull to notice. At court, scandal became routine. Nobles didn't ask if the king had a mistress, they asked how many this week. Foreign ambassadors even wrote home with gossip updates from Versailles, describing it as a brothel with better uniforms. Ironically, Louis believed he was doing a decent job as ruler, balancing state affairs between flirtations and feasts. But while he partied, France quietly sank into debt and discontent, setting the stage for his grandson, Louis XVI, who would eventually pay for it with his head. When Louis XV died, he left behind a kingdom drowning in debt, a court addicted to luxury, and a royal reputation summed up best as "Hiberhi loved by women, loathed by accountants." Christian VII of Denmark reigned from 1766 to 1808. Though reigned might be too generous. To put it mildly, he stumbled through his kingship while others quietly handled the actual ruling. The poor man struggled with severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and seemed only interested in his crown when it involved chasing servants around with cutlery, an act he reportedly found hilarious. His young wife, Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, expected a dignified royal marriage. What she got instead was a husband who mumbled to his hands, enjoyed inappropriate public acts, and galloped down palace corridors on imaginary horses. But where there's royal madness, there's usually intrigue. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's ambitious physician. Intelligent, calculating, and very persuasive, Struensee soon became the real power behind Denmark's throne. And, scandalously, the lover of the queen. While the king was kept busy with puppet shows and sword games, the doctor and queen ran Denmark like their own secret government. T was less a monarchy and more a high-stakes romantic soap opera. But as you might guess, court politics don't stay quiet for long. Once whispers of their affair reached the king's mother, a bloody coup followed. Struensee was executed in grand medieval style, and Caroline Matilda was exiled in disgrace. As for Christian, he drifted back into his delusional world, the king who ruled nothing, the queen who dared too much, and the doctor who flew too close to the sun. Historians call it a constitutional crisis. The rest of us call it Europe's strangest love triangle. Now, let's head to England, where Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch, ruled from 1660 to 1685, proving once and for all that monarchy could look a lot like a never-ending bachelor party. After years in exile, hiding in oak trees and scraping by abroad, Charles returned to the throne determined to bring fun back to England. The country had suffered through Puritan rule. No dancing, no theater, no joy. Charles fixed tea hat instantly, reopening theaters, restoring color, and throwing enough masquerade balls to make Instagram jealous. Of course, the fun didn't stop there. Charles had dozens of mistresses, and those were just the official ones. Among them was Nell Gwyn, the witty actress who famously called herself the Protestant mistress to stand out from all the Catholic ones. Then came Barbara Palmer, the Countess of Castlemaine, who lived in the palace itself and bore several of Charles's children, all generously given titles, lands, and pensions. Discretion was not in Charles's vocabulary. He even built a secret passage so his mistresses could reach his bedroom without bumping into diplomats. His poor wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, endured it all with quiet dignity, and probably a secret stash of wine. Charles had no legitimate heirs, but at least 14 illegitimate ones, a royal family tree so tangled it could use its own reality show. And yet, the people adored him. He made England log again, turning the crown into a symbol of charm and excess. His dying words? Not about his kingdom, not about legacy, just let not poor Nelly starve. Classic Charles, loyal to the end, at least to his favorite mistress. Next up, Sweden's Eric XIV, a ruler whose brain was as unpredictable as his love life. From 1560 to 1568, he reigned in a cloud of poetry, paranoia, and poor decisions. Eric was tall, handsome, and obsessed with astrology. He wouldn't sneeze without checking the stars first. Unfortunately, they never told him to relax. After being politely rejected by Queen Elizabeth I of England repeatedly, he rebounded in spectacular fashion by marrying Karen Mansdotter, a commoner and the daughter of a jailer. The nobility was horrified. Eric, ever defiant, doubled down, but his paranoia soon consumed him. He began accusing nobles of plotting against him, imprisoning them without reason, and even stabbing a man at dinner over a supposed glance at his queen. By then, the stars must have gone silent, because his reign spiraled fast. Hearing voices, disguising himself to spy on his own council, and ranting about invisible enemies, Eric finally got a royal intervention, meaning his brother locked him up and took the crown. Eric spent his final years writing strange love poems from captivity, dreaming of the wife who outlasted his sanity. Sweden learned an important lesson: never trust a king who reads horoscopes before executing people. And finally, we arrive in Naples, where Ferdinand I of Aragon ruled with equal parts charm and terror. On paper, he was everything a good monarch should be: strategic, cultured, and efficient. But his methods? Absolutely chilling. Ferdinand had a peculiar hobby. He liked inviting his enemies to lavish banquets, assuring them of peace and forgiveness, then having them quietly executed after dessert. In one infamous incident, he supposedly had his victims embalmed and displayed in his private gallery, a collection he referred to as "my museum of loyalty." But behind the polished crown and political success was a ruler who believed fear was the best form of diplomacy. And it worked. His court was obedient, his enemies disappeared, and his kingdom stayed strangely stable, though nobody ever accepted dinner invitations without saying their prayers first. From Denmark's delusional king to England's pleasure-loving monarch, from Sweden's star-crossed ruler to Naples' dinner party executioner, these stories remind us that behind every glittering crown lies a messy, deeply human disaster. If you enjoyed tonight's royal roller coaster, hit the like button, subscribe for more hidden corners of history, and tell me in the comments, which of these kings would you least want as your roommate? Until next time, keep your curiosity royal and your sanity safely intact. While most rulers preferred to banish or bury their traitors, Ferdinand had a different approach. He collected them, literally, after executing rebel. Nobles. Ferdinand had their bodies embalmed, stuffed, and carefully displayed in a hidden underground chamber beneath his castle. Ibri, he called it the Black Room. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, he personally led guided tours, walking foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries through his macabre museum of treachery. Each corpse came with its own label, name, crime, and yes, preserved expression. Some screamed forever, others looked eerily calm. One guest reportedly fainted. Ferdinand? He thought it was hilarious. If TripAdvisor had existed, the reviews might have read, 5 stars, absolutely terrifying, would not return without sedation. Febru, but this royal mortician had more skeletons than those in his basement. Ferdinand's romantic record was as messy as his morgue. His official queen was just one of many women in his life. His mistresses ranged from noble ladies to peasant girls, and his illegitimate children seemed to appear across the kingdom like wildflowers after rye. At banquets, flirtation was practically a sport. One ambassador joked that Ferdinand never finished a meal without sampling from multiple courses, political and otherwise. And yet, his people admired him. His strength, his authority, and yes, even his ruthlessness kept Naples stable. Nobles feared rebellion once they'd toured the Black Room, and neighboring rulers thought twice before crossing him. Ferdinand ruled for decades, died peacefully in his bed, and left behind a kingdom secure, if slightly traumatized. His legacy? A prosperous realm, a terrifying basement, and a reminder that while some kings built alliances, others built museums of warning. The year was 1119. The dust of the First Crusade still clung to the shattered stones of Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims flooded into the Holy Land, believing it was finally safe. But beyond the city walls lurked chaos. Bandits prowled the roads. Muslim raiders ambushed caravans. Travelers vanished without a trace. Ibra out of this dang. 9 knights made a sacred vow, not to any king or lord, but to God himself. Led by Hugues de Payens, they pledged their swords and souls to defend Christian pilgrims, living as both monks and warriors. Poverty, chastity, obedience, no wealth, no wives, just faith, steel, and devotion. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A mouthful, yes, but from that final word, temple, they drew the name that would echo through history, the Knights Templar. For 9 long years, they remained an obscure brotherhood, ragged, poor, and fanatically dedicated. They borrowed armor, shared horses, and lived like beggars with blades. But whispers of their discipline and faith spread fast. Soon their reputation reached one of the most powerful men in Christendom, Bernard of Clairvaux, the spiritual superstar of his age. Habriki Bernard saw something divine in them. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helped craft their official code, part monastic part military manual. With papal approval, the Templars went from unknown zealots to a holy elite. Donations poured in. Young nobles traded silk for steel, wealth for vows. From the sands of Jerusalem, the Templars began their ascent, righteous, relentless, and unstoppable. But what began as their greatest blessing, independence under the Pope, would one day seal their doom. With papal backing and blood-red crosses stitched across their white mantles, the Templars became the shock troops of Christendom. Their rule was brutal and simple: never retreat unless outnumbered 3-1. No ransom, no fear, no surrender. They built an empire of fortresses across the Holy Land, strongholds like Safe at Bagras, designed to withstand sieges for years. When others fled, the Templars stood their ground. They were soldiers of faith, the sword of God made flesh. But war wasn't their only battlefield. The Templars were also innovators, administrators, builders, and eventually banker. It began with donations from nobles, then land, then entire estates. Soon, they were managing wealth across continents. A nobleman could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem using a secret coded letter. The world's first system of international banking, they became the medieval equivalent of Swiss bankers. Trusted, efficient, incorruptible, they safeguarded royal treasures, financed crusades, and lent fortunes to kings. They didn't flaunt their riches, their churches were plain, their robes simple. But beneath that humility lay a financial empire. Still, with great power comes great paranoia. Kings began to resent them, untaxed, uncontrollable, and rich beyond royal comprehension. Their allegiance was to the Pope, not the crown. They were an independent power, and that made them dangerous. By the late 13th century, their original mission, protecting the Holy Land, had evaporated. The Crusader states fell one by one. Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, gone. By 1291, Anaka, their last stronghold, had crumbled. The Templars retreated to Cyprus, rich but irrelevant, a warrior order without a war. And that's when their enemy struck. No one watched more closely than King Philip IV of France. Philip the Fair. Fair in name only. He was broke, buried in debt from endless wars, and the Templars were his creditors. They owned vast lands, tax-free, and they answered to no king.
Philip crafted a plan worthy of a villain. He spread rumors.
Blasphemy, heresy, devil worship. Lies, but convincing ones in a superstitious age. Then, on one cold October morning in 1307, Friday the 13th, he struck. Sapperk, at dawn, across France, his soldiers moved in silence. Templars were dragged from their beds, shackled and tortured. Vaults were looted, libraries seized. Under agony, confessions spilled, false, forced, desperate. Some said they spat on the cross, worshipped idols, kissed each other in secret rites. Even Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, confessed, and later recanted. But it was too late. The mighty order that once struck fear into armies now lay broken in chains, undone not by battle, but by betrayal. And so, Friday the 13th entered legend. The day faith was burned, and the world's most powerful brotherhood was silenced in fire and ash. It was theater disguised as justice, a ruthless performance orchestrated by a king determined to destroy his creditors. King Philip IV of France accused the Knights Templar of unspeakable sins, charges so grotesque that few dared to defend them. Pope Clement V, caught between politics and piety, tried to mediate, but Philip acted too swiftly, too mercilessly. Forced into submission, Clement ordered his own investigation, though outside France the reaction was mixed. In England and Spain the accusations often collapsed, and many Templars were freed. But in France, the machinery of condemnation kept grinding. Philip seized their vast wealth, though much of it mysteriously vanished. Some whispered that the Templars had spirited away their treasure, while others believed it was never about gold at all, but about secret knowledge, holy relics, forbidden truths, perhaps even the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant. Whatever the truth, the Templars were finished. Once a proud brotherhood, they became fugitives, prisoners, and martyrs. Philip's victory was won not with swords, but with ink, fire, and deceit. And from that point on, the Red Cross of the Templars would never mean the same thing again. By 1312, their fate was sealed. The Knights Templar, once the most powerful military order in Christendom, were reduced to shattered men in dark cells. Their confessions, extracted under torture, became the justification for their erasure. Under relentless pressure from Philip IV, Pope Clement V officially dissolved the order at the Council of Vienne in March 1312. His papal bull Vox in Excelso stripped them of their name, lands, and honor. The Church called it an act of mercy, a way to prevent scandal. But in truth, it was political execution cloaked in holy authority. The Templar properties were handed to the Knights Hospitaller. Though much of their fortune never arrived, their gold, ledgers, and rumored relics simply vanished. Some said it was hidden. Others suspected it quietly enriched Philip's treasury. Their once mighty financial network, Europe's first multinational enterprise, dissolved like smoke, leaving only mysteries in its wake. Sebrew, 2 years later, in 1314, the story reached its fiery climax. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, emerged from 7 brutal years of imprisonment. Alongside Geoffrey de Charny, another senior knight, he faced execution on a small island in the Seine. Both men had retracted their forced confessions, proclaiming their innocence until the end. For that defiance, they were condemned to burn. As the flames engulfed him, de Molay called upon God to judge those who had betrayed them. According to legend, he erst both King Philip and Pope Clement, declaring they would die within the year. And they did. Clement succumbed to illness within a month, and Philip died suddenly later that same year. Whether divine justice or coincidence, the legend endured. The Templars had died in fire, but their curse lived on in the whispers of Europe. Though their order was destroyed, their legend only grew. The flames that consumed the Templars sparked centuries of fascination. With their castles seized and their leaders executed, it seemed their story should have ended, but instead it transformed. The Templars became immortal symbols of mystery, guardians of forbidden wisdom. People asked, what happened to their treasure, their relics, their sacred scrolls? Myths claimed they had hidden the Holy Grail, concealed the Ark of the Covenant, or even protected the bloodline of Christ himself. No evidence ever surfaced, but in a superstitious world, mystery was as powerful as truth. Rumors spread that the Templars had survived underground. Though officially disbanded, many former members quietly melted into society, some joining other monastic orders, others becoming mercenaries. Yet legend insisted that a secret brotherhood endured, preserving their rituals in hidden vaults, waiting for the right time to rise again. Over the centuries, these tales evolved into the myths we know today. The Templars were credited, or blamed, for everything from Gothic architecture to Freemasonry. Conspiracy theories multiplied, claiming they still pulled the strings of governments and revolutions. In modern times, books and films like The Da Vinci Code and Assassin's Creed turned them into global conspirators and holy guardians, forever rewriting their story. In truth, the real Templars were men of flesh and blood, brave, devout, and deeply flawed. They tried to balance spiritual vows with the brutality of war and paid dearly for it. But myths endure because they offer what history often cannot: meaning and mystery. The real Templars perished in chains, but the mythical ones still ride across imagination. Armored, secretive, eternal. In that sense, King Philip failed. He destroyed their bodies, but not their legacy. 7 centuries later, the Red Cross of the Templars still echoes through time. It appears in architecture, literature, and symbols carved into stone, whispered through conspiracy theories and stories of lost relics. The Templars were more than warriors, they were pioneers. In an age when kings ruled by divine right and banking was condemned as sin, they built a financial network that connected Europe. Their letters of credit were the precursors of modern checks. Their commanderies functioned like early corporate branches. They invented systems of trust and logistics centuries ahead of their time, forging a blueprint for globalization, not with stocks and trade, but with faith and steel. Militarily, they transformed knighthood itself. Before them, chivalry was personal and often hypocrisy. The Templars institutionalized it, turning devotion into discipline. They were not lone knights chasing glory, but trained units, precursors to modern special forces, willing to die for a sacred cause. Their very existence blurred the line between prayer and warfare, proving that belief could be both shield and weapon. And ironically, it was that same belief, twisted by fear and politics, that justified their destruction. Their downfall remains a lesson about power, how wealth and influence, even cloaked in piety, can invite ruin. The Templars' collapse was not just a tragedy, but a warning that no institution, however holy, is safe from ambition. Today, their image is more myth than man, yet that myth shapes memory. It reminds us that history is not only written in victory, but also in ashes. So the next time you see a red cross on white cloth, remember, it once belonged to men who believed they were fighting for God's will until politics and greed consumed them. In that storm of steel, gold, and fire, the legend of the Templars was born, and far away, in 12th century Paris, another symbol of faith and ambition was taking shape, the great cathedral of Notre Dame. The world was changing, trade routes flourished, universities emerged, and the church was asserting its might like never before. Amid this rise stood Bishop Maurice de Sully, a visionary who dreamed of a cathedral so magnificent it would embody the glory of God and the power of France. The old church of Saint-Étienne was crumbling. Paris needed something greater, a monument to both heaven and human achievement. In 1163, construction began. According to tradition, Pope Alexander III himself laid the first stone. Builders toiled with primitive tools, hauling limestone by hand, carving intricate arches, and raising scaffolds that reached for the sky. They knew they would never live to see it finished, but they built for faith, not fame. Each stone, each window, was a prayer in solid form. Ibrahim Notre Dame was like anything before it. Its new Gothic design, with pointed arches, flying buttresses, and radiant stained glass, transformed dark Romanesque gloom into divine light. Every ray of color told a story. Every column and carving symbolized scripture. The cathedral was theology made visible, stone turned into faith. As Paris grew, Notre Dame became its beating heart. Markets, sermons, and students filled its shadow. Generations labored, and by 1200, the great towers and choirs stood tall, shimmering in sunlight. Notre Dame was not merely a building. It was a living act of worship, a reminder of what humanity can create when it reaches for heaven. It rose slowly but triumphantly, reshaping not just the skyline of Paris, but the soul of medieval Europe. What came next would defy both gravity and reason. Notre Dame was unlike anything Paris had ever seen, a dream carved in stone, yet dangerously ambitious. As its walls climbed higher and the vaulted ceilings expanded, a fatal problem revealed itself. Weight. The stone ceilings didn't just press downward, they pushed outward, threatening to tear the walls apart. Traditional Romanesque churches solved this with thick walls and narrow windows, but Notre Dame was meant to breathe, to shimmer with light, to stretch heavenward both in spirit and design. That's when the Masons did something revolutionary. They embraced a daring new idea, the flying buttress. Ed with stained glass depicting saints, angels, and apocalyptic visions. Sunlight poured through them, flooding the sacred space with stories told not from pulpits, but through light itself. Ironically, the original design didn't include these flying buttresses. Early Gothic builders hadn't yet realized their potential. But as the structure rose and strain increased, the Masons adapted on the fly, adding these stone wings in the early 1200s. Some critics found them unsightly, but most stood in awe. Notre Dame looked as if angels themselves were holding it aloft. It became more than a church. It was faith and mathematics joined in perfect harmony, a hymn carved from gravity-defying limestone. By the early 13th century, the eastern end was nearing completion, and attention turned westward. There, the cathedral's face began to take shape, the twin towers and monumental west facade that would define its image for centuries. This wasn't just an entrance, it was a proclamation. Approaching the cathedral, one was meant to feel small, humbled beneath the towering doors and the solemn rows of sculpted kings, prophets, saints, and demons that watched from above. Entering was not just walking into a building, it was stepping into judgment. Construction of the towers began in the 1220s and stretched over decades. Rising nearly 70 meters high, they were never crowned with spires as originally planned. leaving them instead with flat tops, majestic in their simplicity. Between them stood the Gallery of Kings, 28 statues representing the monarchs of Judah, later mistaken for French kings during the Revolution and tragically beheaded. But in their time, they proclaimed divine order and royal legitimacy. Below, the three great portals told stories in stone, the central one depicting the Last Judgment, where Christ sat enthroned, flanked by angels, demons, and souls rising from their graves. For the illiterate masses, these carvings were more than decoration, they were sacred inns. Truction. Above, the great rose window, 10 meters wide, burst into light, transforming sunlight into divine storytelling. By the mid-1200s, Notre Dame's facade stood complete, solemn, and symmetrical, both fortress and sermon in stone. Yet the heart of the cathedral still awaited completion. The vast nave, transepts, and choir that would carry the songs of monks and the prayers of kings. Under architects Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreuil, the transepts were expanded, adorned with immense rose windows that painted the interior in color. The northern window glowed with cool blues of the Old Testament, while the southern burned in reds and golds of the New. Light and fire, two halves of salvation. Inside, slender columns soared like forest trunks, supporting ribbed vaults that met above like hands in prayer. It was not mere architecture, it was motion, a vertical dance guiding every gaze toward heaven. At its heart stood the altar, where relics were venerated and kings knelt in coronatio. But Notre Dame was not reserved for the powerful alone. Peasants, merchants, and pilgrims came too, seeking solace, miracles, or forgiveness. Every inch of its interior, its carvings, its glass, its very floor, told the story of faith. By the late 13th century, the cathedral was nearly complete, lacking only one thing: a crown, the spire. The original spire, made of oak and clad in lead, rose gracefully from the transept's crossing. It wasn't just a structure, it was the cathedral's exclamation point, its prayer in physical form. It took immense craftsmanship to raise such a light yet resilient structure high above the city, able to withstand the battering winds of Paris. When it was finished, the spire pierced the sky like a sword raised in devotion. Around it, gargoyles and chimeras emerged, haunting, whimsical, functional. They drained rainwater, frightened evil spirits, and gave Gothic architecture its trademark mystery. By 1345, nearly 200 years after the first stone was laid, the work was complete. Notre Dame was no longer just a cathedral, it was the cathedral, a symbol of faith, power, and identity. For centuries, it stood as France's beating heart, hosting royal weddings, coronations, and funerals. Its bells rang to announce wars and victories alike. When kings ruled France, Notre Dame ruled their souls. Pilgrims came from across Europe to see its relics, including the fabled crown of thorns. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, the Gothic style had fallen out of fashion. Baroque elegance replaced medieval grandeur. Notre Dame, dark and spiky, was seen as old-fashioned. Neglect set in, and then came revolution. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Notre Dame found itself on the wrong side of history. For centuries, it had symbolized the monarchy and the church, two pillars the revolution sought to destroy. The mob stormed it. Statues were decapitated, bells melted into cannons, altars smashed. The cathedral was desecrated and stripped of sanctity. It became the Temple of Reason, hosting secular festivals and even serving as a wine warehouse. Its roof rotted, its spire was dismantled, and its interior fell silent. Paris had lost its heart. And yet it endured. When Napoleon rose to power, he saw its potential and staged his own coronation there in 1804, crowning himself not by divine right but by will. Notre Dame had once again become a stage for power, though stripped of holiness. By the 1830s, the cathedral was crumbling and dangerously close to demolition. That's when a writer intervened, Victor Hugo. His 1831 novel Notre Dame de Paris, known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, rekindled the world's love for the forgotten cathedral. Through Quasimodo's eyes, Hugo made the building itself a character, wounded, misunderstood, and magnificent. Public outcry followed, and in 1844, a grand restoration began under architects Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus. They restored statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and des a new spire, taller, sharper, more ornate than the original. Ivry Notre Dame reclaimed its place as the soul of Paris. It survived 2 world wars. Its bells rang for liberation in 1944. But in April 2019, disaster struck again. Fire consumed the roof and spire, the flames devouring centuries of history and hours. The world watched in horror, yet once more it survived. The towers stood, the windows endured, and the people vowed to rebuild. Notre Dame has always been more than a cathedral. It is memory, identity, and resilience carved in stone, a monument to the belief that beauty, no matter how many times it burns, can always be reborn.